A smooth clutch pedal makes driving a Fox Mustang a blast. A lot of owners ignore how their clutch pedal feels, though. After all, wear in the clutch linkage happens over time. But your Fox Mustang's gritty, creaky clutch pedal and buzzing shifter are telling you something. Your driveline needs a little TLC. Ford Performance Parts has what you need to get everything smooth again. For this project, we used a new clutch fork and cable kit, release bearing, clutch fork ball stud, input shaft bearing retainer, and aluminum drive shaft. Let's get to work. If your clutch cable has more than 50,000 miles, a new clutch cable works wonders. Ford Performance Parts includes one with their clutch fork and cable kit. To remove the transmission, we unbolted the center console to access the shift boot bolts and remove the boots. You don't have to remove the shifter. After dropping the exhaust, we removed the drive shaft with a 12mm 12-point socket. We used the transmission tail shaft plug to keep the trans fluid from spilling out and making a mess. Next, we removed the 4 bolts holding the transmission to the bell housing and supported the transmission with a cradle we made for our floor jack. To remove the transmission with the shifter attached, we needed to tilt the engine back. The fan would hit the shroud, so we unbolted the shroud from the radiator and hung it from the engine. If you have a helper, you don't need this cradle. The transmission isn't that heavy. Keep the rear transmission mount attached to help steady the gearbox as you remove it. Next, we remove the bell housing, clutch, and flywheel. With the bell housing cover plate out of the way, the source of all those driveway puddles was obvious. The rear main seal is the culprit. The rear main leaks are very common on Fox Mustangs. If your rear main seal is original, chances are your Mustang looks just like this. Yuck. It's best to remove the rear main seal with a special puller, but there's another way, if you're careful. We drilled 2 pilot holes in the face of the rear main seal and installed some number 8 sheet metal screws. We were very careful not to nick the crankshaft or the seal bore. Then we used vice grip pliers to pry out the old seal. The original seal had just 1 lip, on the right. When oil got past here, it ended up on the driveway. Newer seals like this one from Ford Performance Parts has 2 lips that do a much better job of keeping the oil inside the engine where it belongs. We lubricated the seal and the crankshaft with assembly grease and carefully tapped the seal into the bore. The clutch release bearing slides on the input shaft bearing retainer sleeve. The OEM sleeve is aluminum, which can gall, and the clutch release bearing catches as it slides back and forth on the sleeve. This OEM part wasn't worn that badly yet, but we're going to replace it with the steel unit from Ford Performance Parts as a precaution. After removing the input shaft bearing retainer bolts, we used a screwdriver in this pocket to pop it loose. The OEM bearing retainer on the left is entirely aluminum, whereas the Ford Performance Parts retainer features a steel sleeve that's significantly more durable. The Ford Performance Parts input shaft bearing retainer is machined to the same tolerances as the original, so we just transferred the bearing race and shim from the OEM part to the new retainer. We used anaerobic gasket maker on the sealing surface of the input shaft bearing retainer. It's easier to use than silicone and perfect for rigid metal-to-metal applications like this. We also applied some sealant to the bolts because the threaded holes go through to the case. We checked the input shaft end play by feel. It shouldn't have any slop in or out, but should have a little side-to-side freedom and spin freely. We used a chisel so we could use vice grip pliers to grab the output shaft seal and pry it from the tail shaft. A scrap piece of 2.5-inch exhaust tubing and a block of wood made installing the new seal a breeze. The original release bearing on the left has seen better days and is often the source of all kinds of issues. Whenever the transmission is out, it's best to replace the bearing with a fresh one from Ford Performance Parts. The ball stud is also a notorious wear point. The original pivot ball stud on the left on this 1986 Mustang showed noticeable wear, so we swapped it in favor of a new stud from Ford Performance Parts. We noted that the OEM pivot ball stud had a lock washer under it, so we transferred the lock washer to the new pivot ball stud before tightening it down. This washer must be used to maintain proper clutch fork geometry. Worn clutch forks are also a common issue on Foxes. This fork had a weird stamping imperfection right where it contacts the release bearing. The original clutch fork can wear out in several places, so it's easiest just to replace it. Fortunately, the Ford Performance Parts clutch fork is an exact replacement, right down to the original part number. Another source of leaks at the rear of the engine are the flywheel bolts because the holes are drilled all the way through the crankshaft flange. This means oil can seep past the threads. We use sealant on the threads to stop future leaks. The flywheel and crankshaft are drilled so they only install one way. This keeps the engine balanced. There aren't many good ways to hold the flywheel while torquing the bolts. A couple scrap straps of metal can be used as an impromptu holding fork to keep the flywheel from spinning while you torque the bolts. After cleaning the flywheel and clutch surfaces, we installed the clutch. It's important to tighten the clutch cover a little at a time in a star pattern to avoid warping it. Sometimes it's a challenge to get the transmission stabbed the last half inch during installation. Do not use the transmission bolts to draw the transmission into the bell housing. That's a good way to break the transmission ears or strip the bell housing threads, and then you're screwed. Here's an easy trick. Hook up the clutch linkage and have an assistant press the clutch pedal, which allows the clutch disc to float just enough to get the transmission fully seated. The last piece of the puzzle was the Ford Performance Parts aluminum drive shaft. It's our go-to solution to cure worn-out slip yokes, sloppy U-joints, and poor shaft balance in one fell swoop. It's also 4 pounds lighter than the steel stock shaft. With her driveline full of fresh parts, this old Fox Mustang is now a smooth driving machine that doesn't leave a trail of oil wherever it goes.